Lydia tapped her fingers against the steering wheel as the paved road gradually gave way to gravel. The radio had lost signal 15 minutes ago, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the intermittent crunch of tires over loose stone. Her small hatchback wasn't built for this terrain, but it was managing, barely. The trees grew denser on either side, their shadows stretching across the narrowing road like long fingers. Lydia glanced at her phone propped on the dashboard. No service, as expected. That was the point of this whole excursion, wasn't it? To disconnect, to breathe, to stop seeing notifications about client revisions in her sleep. 3 days ago, she'd been staring blankly at her computer screen, the cursor blinking mockingly at her as she tried to summon any creative energy for the brand redesign due next week. Her desk plant, a supposedly unkillable snake plant, had begun to brown at the edges, much like her mental state. That was when she'd made the decision she needed to get away immediately. No more fluorescent office lights, no more midnight emails, no more takeout containers piling up in the recycling bin. The camping reservation had been spontaneous, booked on her lunch break. Lydia hadn't been camping since college, but something about the idea of trees instead of concrete, stars instead of city lights, had felt like salvation. The ranger station appeared around a bend, a rustic wooden building with a sloped green roof. Lydia parked and stepped out, stretching her legs after the 3-hour drive from the city. The air smelled of pine and earth. Unfamiliar but welcome after months of car exhaust and the neighbor's perpetual cigarette smoke. A bell jingled as she pushed open the door to the station. Inside, the walls were covered with wildlife posters, trail maps, and warnings about proper food storage to avoid attracting bears. A man in his 50s with a neatly trimmed salt and pepper beard looked up from his desk. "Afternoon," he said, adjusting his Forest Service cap. "Looking to camp." "Wes, I have a reservation." Lydia Engie, the ranger, his name badge red meek, tapped at an ancient-looking computer. "Solo trip?" he asked, glancing up at her with a slight furrow in his brow. "That's right," Lydia said, suddenly feeling defensive. "Just me, Isham." Mike's eyes returned to the screen. 2 nights, correct? Checking out Sunday. "Wes." Mike nodded slowly, then reached for a map of the campground. He circled a spot with his pen. "I've got you at campsite 9B. It's about a half-mile hike from the parking area." He hesitated, then added, "There are closer sites available if you'd prefer." 70 just opened up this morning. Something in his tone made Lydia curious. "Is there something wrong with 9B? "No, not wrong exactly." Mike set down his pen, looking uncomfortable. "It's a beautiful spot, very private. Backs right up against the old-growth forest. Well, we've had some complaints." "What kind of complaints?" "Nothing specific. People saying they felt watched. Couldn't sleep well." He gave a forced chuckle. "One guy even claimed his camera kept taking pictures on its own. Probably just wildlife, you know. Deer, maybe a curious raccoon." Mike cleared his throat. "Anyway, people don't usually come back from that one relaxed, is all I'm saying. And that's the point of getting away, right?" Under normal circumstances, Lydia might have changed sites immediately. But something about the ranger's half-warning, half-apology triggered her stubborn streak. Maybe it was the subtle implication that she, as a solo female camper, couldn't handle a spooky campsite. 9B sounds perfect," she said firmly. "I'm looking for privacy." Mike nodded, though he didn't look convinced. "Just follow the red trail markers from the east parking lot. And remember, no cell service out here, so if you need anything, there's an emergency phone at the ranger station. I'll be here until 8 tonight and back at 6 tomorrow morning." "Thanks," Lydia said, taking the map and the campsite permit he handed her. "I'm sure it'll be a fine." The hike to campsite 9B was more strenuous than Lydia had anticipated. The trail wound uphill, crossing a small stream before finally opening to a clearing surrounded by towering pines. A fire pit ringed with stones occupied the center of the site, with a wooden picnic table nearby. A sign marked 9B was nailed to a tree, along with the usual campground rules. Lydia dropped her backpack with relief. The site was indeed private. She couldn't see or hear any neighboring campers. Just beyond the clearing, the forest grew noticeably darker and older, with massive trees that must have stood for centuries. She made quick work of setting up her tent, a compact two-person dome that she'd bought secondhand for this trip. After arranging her sleeping bag and unpacking essential supplies, Lydia checked her watch. Only 3 in the afternoon. Plenty of daylight left to explore. With her camera slung around her neck and a small day pack containing water and trail mix, Lydia set out on one of the hiking paths that branched off from her campsite. The trail was well maintained but narrow, winding through ferns and past moss-covered boulders. The forest was alive with sound: birdsong, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant murmur of running water. For the first time in months, Lydia felt the knot of anxiety in her chest begin to loosen. She stopped frequently to photograph interesting fungi, unusual tree formations, and once a deer that watched her calmly from a distance before disappearing into the undergrowth. By the time she returned to her campsite, the sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows through the trees. Lydia collected firewood, arranged kindling in the fire pit, and soon had a cheerful blaze going. She heated a can of soup over the flames and ate it with crackers while watching the fire dance. This was what she needed: simplicity, silence, solitude. No clients, no deadlines, no constant stream of emails demanding her attention. Just the forest and her thoughts. As darkness settled more firmly, Lydia added another log to the fire and pulled out her sketchbook. She began to draw the outline of the trees against the fading sky, losing herself in the familiar rhythm of pencil against paper. A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond the circle of firelight. Lydia looked up, suddenly aware of how exposed she felt. "Hello," she called, immediately feeling foolish. It was probably just an animal, a raccoon or possum exploring the edge of her campsite. When no further sounds came, she returned to her sketching, though with diminished concentration. The fire gradually died down to embers, and the night grew chillier. Lydia zipped her jacket up to her chin and decided it was time for bed. After making sure the fire was properly extinguished, she retreated to her tent, flashlight in hand. Inside, she changed into warm sleep clothes and slipped into her sleeping bag, using her bundled jacket as a pillow. Despite her urban habits, exhaustion quickly overtook her, and soon she was sleeping deeply beneath the canopy of trees. Lydia woke with the dawn, sunlight filtering through the blue fabric of her tent. For a moment, she lay still, relishing the unfamiliar sounds of morning in the forest. Birdsong more varied and enthusiastic than the city pigeons she was accustomed to, the gentle rustle of wind through pine needles. After a breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee boiled over a small camping stove, Lydia decided to try another trail. This one led deeper into the old-growth forest, where sunlight struggled to penetrate the dense canopy. The atmosphere was almost primeval, hushed and reverent. She spent the morning hiking, stopping occasionally to photograph particularly striking scenes: a shaft of sunlight illuminating a patch of emerald moss, a twisted tree root that resembled a sleeping dragon, a clearing carpeted with tiny white wildflowers. By early afternoon, Lydia had circled back to her campsite, pleasantly tired and hungry. She made a simple lunch and stretched out on a blanket near her tent, basking in the dappled sunlight. She'd brought a novel with her but found herself too content to read, preferring instead to simply exist in the moment, listening to the forest breathe around her. As the day began to wane, Lydia set about preparing for her second night. She gathered more firewood, tidied her campsite, and reorganized her supplies. The peacefulness of the day had all but erased her memory of the ranger's strange warning about campsite 9B. That changed as twilight descended. Lydia was feeding small branches into her newly kindled fire when she noticed something odd: a rectangular white object attached to a tree at the edge of her campsite. Curious, she approached it, her brow furrowing in confusion. It was a Polaroid photograph, nailed directly into the bark with a small metal tack. Lydia pulled it free, a chill running through her that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. The photo showed her, from earlier that day setting up her tent. In the image, she was bent over, hammering a stake into the ground, completely unaware of being photographed. Lydia spun around, scanning the darkening forest that surrounded her campsite. "Hello," she called, her voice betraying her unease. "Is someone there?" Nothing but the usual forest sounds answered her, With trembling fingers, she turned the Polaroid over. The back was blank. No message, no explanation. Just a photograph that shouldn't exist. Taken by someone she hadn't seen, capturing a private moment in what she had believed was perfect solitude. The campfire popped loudly, sending up a shower of sparks, and Lydia jumped, the photo still clutched in her hand. Suddenly, Campsite 9B felt much less like an escape and much more like a trap. Lydia stood frozen, staring at the Polaroid in her trembling hand. The crackling fire behind her suddenly seemed insufficient protection against the darkness pressing in from the forest. She turned the photo over once more, as if expecting some explanation to materialize on its blank, reverse side. Nothing. Slowly, she raised her gaze to scan the tree line surrounding her campsite. The fading light painted the woods in deepening shadows, creating countless places where someone could hide and watch. Someone who had been watching her. "Hello?" she called again, her voice stronger this time, tinged with anger to mask her fear. "I know you're out there. This isn't funny." The forest absorbed her words without echo or response. Only the gentle rustling of leaves and the occasional pop from the campfire broke the silence. Lydia retreated to the center of her campsite, closer to the fire's warmth and light. She considered her options. She could pack up immediately and try to hike back to her car, but darkness was falling rapidly, and navigating the trail at night seemed risky. She could stay put until morning, barricaded in her tent, though the thin nylon suddenly seemed absurdly inadequate protection. As she deliberated, something white caught her eye, another rectangular shape affixed to a different tree, just at the edge of the firelight's reach. Her throat tightened. Against her better judgment, Lydia approached it slowly. Another Polaroid. This one showed her from earlier that day, sitting by the stream during her morning hike, untying her boots to dip her feet in the cool water. A private, peaceful moment she had thought she'd experienced alone. Her eyes darted to another tree and sure enough, a third Polaroid. This one captured her preparing lunch, her back to the camera as she bent over her camping stove. Lydia's heart hammered against her ribs as she spun around, spotting more white rectangles, nailed to trees around the perimeter of her campsite. Each one a stolen moment from her day. Each one proof that someone had been following her, watching her, documenting her movements without her knowledge. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but Lydia forced herself to think. These photos hadn't been here earlier. Whoever placed them must have done so while she was at her campsite, which meant they had been close by, moving silently just beyond her awareness. The thought made her skin crawl. She snatched the photos from the trees one by one, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly as she moved around the campsite. 7 Polaroids in total. 7 moments stolen from her day, from different angles, different distances. In the last one, taken during her afternoon rest, the camera had been close enough to capture the title of the novel she'd brought but hadn't read. Lydia returned to the fire and threw the photos in, watching as they curled and blackened in the flames. It offered little satisfaction. Burning the evidence didn't change the fact that someone was out there watching. The practical side of her brain began to assert itself through the fog of fear. She needed to leave. Now. Forget the darkness. Forget the difficulty of navigating the trail at night. She needed to get back to the ranger station. Lydia moved quickly, shoving essential items into her backpack. Water bottle, flashlight, car keys, phone useless without signal, but still a comfort. She left her tent and the rest of her camping gear. She could come back for them tomorrow, preferably with the ranger or police as escort. Just as she zipped her backpack closed, she heard it. A soft click and whir, distinctive and unmistakable. The sound of a Polaroid camera ejecting a photo. Lydia whirled toward the sound, her flashlight beam slicing through the darkness between trees. For a split second, she thought she saw movement. A shadow sliding behind a thick trunk. But when she focused her light there, nothing remained but gently swaying ferns. "I'm leaving," she shouted into the darkness, her voice tight with fear and anger. "Do you hear me? I'm going to the ranger station, and I'm reporting this." No response came from the forest, but Lydia couldn't shake the certainty that her words had been heard and understood. With shaking hands, she shouldered her backpack and grabbed her flashlight. The trail back to the parking area was marked with reflective blazes that should be visible in her flashlight beam. Half a mile. That's all she needed to hike to reach her car. 15 minutes at a normal pace, maybe 25 in the dark. Lydia took one last look at her abandoned campsite, then turned and headed for the trail, her flashlight illuminating the path ahead. The beam seemed feeble against the profound darkness of the forest at night. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snap of a twig made her flinch. About 100 yards down the trail, something white appeared in her flashlight beam. Another Polaroid, freshly nailed to a tree directly alongside the path. With growing dread, Lydia approached it. The photo showed her from just moments ago, standing by her tent packing her backpack. The image was grainy in the low light, but her fear was clearly visible on her face. They were still watching, still following. Lydia yanked the photo from the tree and crumpled it in her fist, then continued down the trail at a faster pace, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. She had to get back to the ranger station, had to find Mike, the ranger, had to report this sick game someone was playing. The trail forked and Lydia hesitated. She didn't remember a fork on her hike in. She consulted her mental map of the route. Straight from the parking area to campsite 9B, no turns. Had she somehow wandered onto a different path? She played her flashlight beam along both options. The right fork seemed more worn, more traveled. Lydia took it, moving even faster now, nearly jogging despite the treacherous footing. Another Polaroid appeared in her flashlight beam. This one showed her standing at the fork in the trail, looking confused. It couldn't have been taken more than 30 seconds ago. They were right behind her. Lydia abandoned all pretense of calm and began to run, her flashlight bobbing wildly, illuminating fragments of the trail. Roots, rocks, fallen branches. She stumbled once, twice, catching herself against tree trunks, her palms scraping against rough bark. The trail continued to wind through the forest, unfamiliar now, nothing like the direct path she had taken to her campsite. Had she made a wrong turn? Was she getting deeper into the woods, rather than closer to safety? Her lungs burned, and a stitch stabbed at her side, forcing her to slow to a fast walk. As her breathing steadied, Lydia became aware of the absolute silence surrounding her. No night birds called, no insects chirped. Even the ever-present rustle of wind through leaves had ceased, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Another Polaroid caught her flashlight beam. She approached it with dread. The photo showed her running down the trail, the image blurred with her motion, her face a mask of terror. "Stop it," she screamed into the darkness. "What do you want from me?" Only silence answered. Lydia tore the photo from the tree and continued forward, trying to maintain her bearings. If she kept moving downhill, eventually she would reach the road or the ranger station. She had to believe that. The trail narrowed, winding between massive, ancient trees that seemed to lean inward, their branches forming a cathedral, like canopy that blocked even the faint light of stars. Lydia's flashlight beam caught more Polaroids nailed to trees along the path, each one documenting her journey, her increasing panic. She ignored them now, focused solely on moving forward, on escaping. After what felt like hours but could only have been 40 minutes at most, the trail opened into a small clearing. Lydia stopped short, her blood freezing in her veins. In the center of the clearing stood her tent. Somehow, impossibly, the trail had led her in a circle back to campsite 9B. The fire she had abandoned was now just glowing embers, casting a faint, ruddy light over the scene. But something was wrong. The tent. Her tent was different. The front flap hung open, slashed from top to bottom by what must have been a knife or razor. The clean cut gaped like a wound against the blue nylon. With mounting horror, Lydia approached her violated shelter. Her hands shook so badly now that the flashlight beam danced erratically across the campsite. When she reached the tent and peered inside, a small sound escaped her throat, halfway between a gasp and a sob. More Polaroids. Dozens of them, scattered across her sleeping bag. She forced herself to look closer, to shine her light on the images. These photos were different. More invasive, more terrifying. They showed the inside of her tent, while she had been away hiking. Her sleeping bag, her backpack, her clothes. And one final photo, centered on her pillow, showed her asleep from the previous night, the photographer standing over her, close enough to touch her face. Lydia staggered backward, bile rising in her throat. They had been in her tent while she slept, watching her, photographing her at her most vulnerable. A soft click and whir came from directly behind her. Lydia spun around, her flashlight illuminating a Polaroid as it was ejected from a camera held by invisible hands. The photo fell to the ground at her feet, slowly developing in the dim light. She shouldn't look. She knew she shouldn't look, but she couldn't stop herself from directing her flashlight beam downward. As the image clarified, Lydia saw herself, from mere seconds ago, standing in front of her tent, her face contorted with horror as she discovered the photos inside. The distance between the camera and subject in this latest photo couldn't have been more than 10 feet. 10 feet. The photographer was right here, in the clearing with her, but her flashlight beam revealed nothing but empty air where a person should be standing. Lydia's flashlight flickered once, twice, then went dark. In the sudden blackness, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching across the leaf-strewn ground. Darkness engulfed Lydia as the footsteps drew closer, crunching softly on the forest floor. Her muscles locked in place, terror paralyzing her limbs. Frantically, she shook her flashlight, hitting it against her palm. After what felt like an eternity, the beam flickered back to life, weak but present. She swept the light in a panicked arc around the clearing. Nothing, no one. The footsteps had stopped. The momentary reprieve from darkness restored some of Lydia's rational thought. She needed to move, now. Forget the tent, forget her camping gear. Survival was the only priority. She backed away from the tent, keeping her flashlight trained on the surrounding trees. The ranger station. She had to reach the ranger station. If the trail had led her in a circle, she'd have to forge her own path, downhill. The ranger station and parking lot were at a lower elevation than the campsite. If she kept moving downhill, she would eventually reach the road. With this desperate plan in mind, Lydia turned and plunged into the forest, away from the trail, crashing through underbrush and weaving between trees. Branches clawed at her face and arms, but she pushed forward, driven by raw fear. After several minutes of blind flight, she paused, gasping for breath. The forest seemed to press in around her, watchful and silent. Her flashlight beam probed the darkness ahead, revealing nothing but more trees, more shadows. A familiar white rectangle caught the edge of her light. Another Polaroid, nailed to a tree directly in her path. Lydia approached it slowly, dread pooling in her stomach. This photo showed her running through the forest, taken from behind, the image tilted and blurry as if the photographer had been moving too, pursuing her. Her gaze darted to another tree, and another. More Polaroids, forming a path through the forest. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "This isn't possible." The photos couldn't have been placed there in advance. They showed her current flight through the forest, her exact route, which she had chosen randomly in her panic. And yet, here they were, evidence that whoever, whatever, was tracking her knew not only where she had been, but where she would go. Lydia turned to run in another direction, but more white rectangles gleamed in her flashlight beam. Everywhere she looked, Polaroids marked the trees, creating a maze with no exit. And all of them, every single one, showed her running, stumbling, crying. Her flashlight flickered again, the beam growing noticeably dimmer. Battery dying. Of course it was. Why had she not checked it before leaving for this trip? Another oversight in a weekend full of poor decisions. The rational part of her mind, the part still capable of analytical thought, began to question her surroundings. This wasn't natural. People didn't appear and disappear. Cameras didn't take photos on their own. Photos didn't materialize on trees faster than humanly possible. Whatever was happening at Campsite 9B defied logical explanation. Lydia forced herself to calm down, to breathe deeply. If she couldn't escape, perhaps she could confront. She steadied her failing flashlight beam on the forest ahead. "Who are you?" she called, her voice stronger than she felt. "What do you want from me?" The forest remained silent. Not even the nocturnal creatures made a sound. It was as if the entire woodland held its breath, waiting. Her flashlight dimmed further, the beam barely penetrating the darkness now. With its fading light, Lydia saw yet another Polaroid on a tree just ahead. Despite her fear, she approached it, drawn by a perverse need to understand what was happening. This photo was different. It showed her from the front, standing in this exact spot, looking at this exact photo. A perfect recursive image. Lydia looking at a photo of Lydia looking at a photo. But what chilled her blood wasn't the impossible timing. It was her expression in the picture. Her face was contorted in horror, her mouth open in a silent scream, her eyes wide with terror as she looked not at the photo but at something behind her. Something the real Lydia couldn't see because it was behind her right now. She whirled around, flashlight raised like a weapon. The beam caught something, a figure standing motionless between two distant trees. The light was too weak, the distance too great to make out details, but Lydia could see enough to know it was humanoid in shape, tall and unnaturally still. Her flashlight died completely, plunging her into absolute darkness. A click and whir sounded directly in front of her. Lydia stumbled backward, colliding with the tree trunk. A rustling noise surrounded her, like dozens of papers fluttering in a breeze. In the pitch blackness, she could see nothing, but she felt something brush against her cheek. Light, like a photograph being drawn across her skin. She screamed then, a primal sound torn from the depths of her being. Her paralysis broke, and she ran blindly through the forest, hands outstretched to protect herself from tree trunks and low branches. She no longer cared which direction she was going. Her only thought was to put distance between herself and whatever presence haunted Campsite 9B. How long she ran, Lydia couldn't tell. Time seemed to stretch and compress in the darkness. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, and eventually she collapsed to her knees, physically unable to continue. As she knelt there gasping for breath, something miraculous happened. The forest around her gradually lightened, not from her flashlight, which remained dead in her hand, but from the first pale glow of dawn seeping through the trees. Lydia looked up, disoriented. Had she been running all night? It seemed impossible, yet the evidence was undeniable as birds began their morning chorus, and the shadows retreated before the approaching day. In the growing light, she could see she was in an unfamiliar part of the forest. No trail was visible, no markers to indicate her location relative to the campground or ranger station. But the forest looked normal in the daylight, just trees and underbrush and morning dew sparkling on spider webs. She got to her feet, wincing at her battered state. Her jeans were torn at the knees, her hands and forearms scratched and bloody from countless collisions with branches. But she was alive. She had survived the night. With the sun as her guide, Lydia oriented herself and began walking east, where she believed the ranger station lay. The forest seemed benign now, filled with the ordinary sounds of wildlife and wind. Had she imagined it all? The stalker with the Polaroid camera, the photos that appeared as if by magic, the figure in the darkness. Her foot struck something that crackled under her weight. Lydia looked down and froze. A Polaroid photo lay on the forest floor, partially covered by leaves. With trembling fingers, she picked it up. The image showed her asleep in her tent, taken from directly above, as if the photographer had been hovering over her sleeping form. In the corner of the photo, barely visible, was a hand reaching toward her face. Long-fingered, pale, not quite human. Lydia dropped the photo as if it had burned her. No, she hadn't imagined any of it. She began walking faster, then jogging, ignoring the protest from her exhausted muscles. The forest thinned gradually, and finally, mercifully, she spotted a gravel road through the trees. The road. Civilization. Safety. Lydia stumbled onto the gravel, relief flooding through her. She wasn't certain where along the park road she had emerged, but if she followed it, she would eventually reach the ranger station or the main entrance. She walked along the road's edge, jumping at every sound from the forest beside her. After about 20 minutes, a familiar building came into view. The ranger station, its windows glowing warmly in the early morning light. Lydia broke into a run, tears of relief streaming down her dirt-streaked face. She burst through the door, the bell jingling cheerfully above her head. The ranger, Mike, looked up from his desk, coffee mug halfway to his lips. His eyes widened her appearance. "Good Lord," he said, setting down his mug and standing quickly. "Are you all right? What happened? The words tumbled from Lydia's mouth in a chaotic stream. The Polaroids, the slashed tent, the figure in the woods, her night of terror. As she spoke, she watched the ranger's expression change from concern to something more guarded. When she finished, Mike was silent for a long moment. Then he sighed, rubbing his hand across his bearded face. "I should have been clearer with my warning," he said finally. "It's not just that people don't come back from 9B relaxed. Some don't come back at all." Lydia stared at him. "What? 3 hikers disappeared from that campsite last year, 2 the year before. Always solo campers, always at 9B. Mike wouldn't meet her eyes. We kept it quiet. Bad for tourism, you understand. Officially they're just missing hikers who wandered off trail, and you kept the campsite open." Lydia's voice rose in disbelief and anger. "You let people stay there. We tried closing it," Mike said defensively. "Roped it off, marked it restricted, but people kept going there anyway. The ropes would be cut, the signs taken down, as if the campsite itself wanted visitors." He shook his head. "Eventually, management decided it was better to monitor it than pretend it wasn't there. I always warn people like I warned you. A warning isn't enough." Lydia slammed her palm on the counter. "People are in danger. I was in danger. But you made it out," Mike said, finally looking at her directly. "That's more than most can say." A cold feeling settled in Lydia's stomach. What happens to the ones who don't make it out? Mike opened a drawer in his desk and withdrew a manila folder. He hesitated, then pushed it across the counter to her. Lydia opened it with shaking hands. Inside were police reports, search records, and newspaper clippings about the missing hikers, and photos. Dozens of Polaroid photos of people at campsite 9B, setting up tents, cooking meals, reading books, sleeping. The final photo of each person showed them looking at Polaroid pictures nailed to trees, expressions of dawning horror on their faces. "These were found at the campsite after each disappearance," Mike said quietly, "along with the missing person's belongings. But never any bodies, never any tracks leading away from the site. They just vanished." Lydia flipped through the photos, her heart pounding. "Why don't you destroy the campsite? Cut down the trees, fill in the clearing." "We tried that too," Mike said, his voice hollow. "Sent in a whole crew with chainsaws and bulldozers. Next day, everything was back exactly as it had been, like we'd never touched it." But Lydia closed the folder, unable to look at the photos any longer. "I need to report this. To the police, to the Forest Service headquarters, to someone who will actually do something." "Go ahead," Mike said, not unkindly. "But I doubt they'll believe you any more than they believed us. Some places in these woods are just wrong. 9B is one of them." Lydia gathered her remaining strength and turned toward the door. She needed to get to her car, to drive far away from this forest and never return. As she put her hand on the doorknob, Mike called after her, "Miss Ng, you might want to check your pockets." A something in his tone made her pause. Slowly, Lydia reached into her jacket pocket. Her fingers closed around a small, rectangular piece of paper that she knew hadn't been there before. With a sense of inevitable dread, she pulled it out, a Polaroid photograph. The last one, it showed her standing exactly as she was now, at the ranger station door, her hand on the knob, a photo in her other hand. In the image, her face was turned slightly, looking back over her shoulder at something behind her. Something tall and indistinct that stood in the corner of the ranger station. Something that, in the real world, was standing behind her right now. Lydia didn't turn around. She yanked open the door and ran into the morning sunlight, the photograph still clutched in her trembling hand. Evidence of something impossible, something that had followed her out of the woods, something that would always be just behind her, camera ready, waiting for the perfect moment to take the final shot.
It takes a lot of time to create these videos. I would really appreciate your support. All I ask for is a quick like on the video and subscribe. Thank you so much.